The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, drumming a slow confession against the cracked windows of the Millstone gas stop. Inside, under flickering lights, Aaron Vale stood quietly at the counter, his voice low but steady, as he asked for a pack of cigarettes and a cup of coffee. Marla Denning glanced at his ragged jacket and mud-streaked boots with the quick judgment of someone who'd seen too many drifters and too little truth. When he slid his tattered ID across the counter, the edges worn thin by years of travel, she sighed, rolling her eyes before tearing it down the center with a snap sharp enough to silence the rain. The sound lingered, like something sacred breaking. Aaron didn't move. His eyes met hers. No anger, no plea. Just the quiet look of a man too tired to defend his name. He picked up his torn identity, folded it neatly, and whispered, "You didn't have to do that." Outside, thunder rolled like a warning. Hours later, when black SUVs lined the lot and men in suits stepped into the storm, the clerk would replay that moment until it became a scar. Marla's nerves jittered with every raindrop against the glass. She replayed his quiet words. "You didn't have to do that," until they began to sound like a verdict. The store's humming lights seemed louder, every shadow bending toward the counter as if accusing her. Outside, she saw the gleam of headlights slowing on the highway. Maybe he'd come back, she thought, to curse her or to ask for help. Instead, a convoy of black vehicles eased into the lot, the rain glancing off their polished hoods like mercury. She froze as tall men stepped out, their coats fluttering in the wind, their badges glinting beneath the storm. For the first time that night, she felt small, fragile, and completely unprepared for the truth that had followed her home to work. The gas station door opened with a hiss, and the cold rain followed the agents in like an unwelcome witness. Agent Caldwell scanned the empty aisles, his voice calm but deliberate as he asked for the man's name. Marla stammered, the sound of her own guilt louder than her words. She told them he'd left an hour ago, that he was just some drifter with a bad ID. Caldwell's expression didn't change. Only his eyes sharpened. "We're looking for him by rank," he said quietly, showing her a file stamped in red. "Classified, Commander A. Vale." The realization hit her like a current, and the store's lights flickered once before going still. Outside, Sheriff Don McCreary arrived, pulling his patrol truck beside the black SUVs, his boots splashing through puddles. He frowned at the federal SEALs and the men in suits. "What's going on here?" he demanded, brushing rain from his hat. Caldwell turned to him with the patience of authority. "We're tracking a missing officer, Commander Aaron Vale, last seen right here." McCreary's jaw tightened. He knew the name from the war memorial up on Ashfield Hill. Inside, Marla pressed her palm against the cold glass, staring at her reflection split by the storm. The storm finally broke, leaving the town steeped in a heavy silence. The FBI team swept the roadside ditches with flashlights, and for a brief second one beam caught movement near the pines, then vanished. Inside, Marla sat behind the counter, trembling as she reread the torn ID. The part that remained showed only one word intact: "Commander." She whispered it to herself, like a prayer of regret. In that fragile moment, justice was not a force of law but of conscience, an unseen weight pressing on her chest as the truth settled over Millstone. By dawn, Millstone's mist had thickened into a pale shroud, swallowing the highway in silence. Agent Pierce Caldwell stood at the edge of the gas station lot, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they came. Sheriff McCreary's impatience broke through the quiet like gravel underfoot. "You're telling me that drifter was a commander?" he asked, disbelief tangled with guilt. Caldwell didn't answer. He only stared at the horizon where faint footprints led away into the woods. Inside the store, Marla Denning sat motionless, the torn ID in her lap. The buzzing sign outside had died overnight, leaving the word open half-lit, like a false promise. The investigation had begun, but justice as it always did, was already whispering through the fog. The agents moved methodically, sweeping the nearby woods, their voices low but urgent through radios. Every few minutes, Caldwell's tone cut through the static. "Report any trace." He's resourceful. McCreary trailed behind, muttering about red tape and how the town didn't need another scandal. Marla lingered outside the door, arms wrapped around herself, watching the forest swallow them. The air was heavy with secrets. When a faint echo of movement stirred among the trees, Caldwell raised his hand, and the team froze. For a heartbeat, the fog shifted, revealing the faint silhouette of Aaron Vale leaning against a pine, watching them with calm detachment before vanishing again. By the time they reached the tree line, the tracks were fading into soft mud. Caldwell crouched, studying the imprints like a code only he could read. "He's not running," he said quietly. "He's watching." McCreary frowned, unsettled by the idea. Marla approached cautiously, clutching her coat against the chill, guilt pulling her forward. "I didn't know who he was," she said to no one in particular. Caldwell's eyes met hers with restrained intensity. "You never know who anyone is," he replied, his tone carrying both accusation and mercy. The forest around them exhaled, and a single crow took flight into the gray morning, as if punctuating the truth. The agents regrouped at the gas station as the rain returned in light, persistent threads. Caldwell stood at the counter, examining the torn ID under a portable lamp. He studied the edges like fragments of truth, piecing together a life that had unraveled far from recognition. "Commander Aaron Vale," he murmured. "Silver Star. Missing since 2016. Marla swallowed hard. He said nothing. "Dust thanked me after I—" Her voice broke. McCreary shifted uncomfortably, realizing they weren't chasing a fugitive, but a ghost of honor forgotten. Justice had a cruel sense of irony. It often showed up too late, wearing regret like a badge. Outside, beyond the tree line, Aaron Vale knelt beside a fallen branch, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the torn halves of his ID. He pressed them together, smoothing the paper as if reassembling his life. In the distance, he could hear faint radio chatter and the murmur of engines. The badge he once wore, a tarnished emblem tucked inside his coat, caught a brief gleam of morning light. He smiled faintly, not out of pride but of closure. Then he stood, turned toward the open road, and whispered something lost to the wind. For him, justice was never about punishment. It was about being remembered as more than a ghost in a storm. The morning stretched long and heavy as the investigation widened beyond the gas station. Inside, Marla Denning sat across from Agent Pierce Caldwell, her trembling hands wrapped around a paper cup of stale coffee. Each question felt like a confession. "Did he seem dangerous?" Caldwell asked calmly. She shook her head. "No, just broken." The sheriff stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, guilt thick in the air. "You know," he muttered. "I remember that name now. Vale. We carved it on the war memorial up on Ashfield Hill." Caldwell looked up slowly, realization settling like fog over the room. The man they were searching for had been declared dead 7 years ago. Caldwell and McCreary drove up to Ashfield Hill, where the wind carried a soft whistle through rows of names etched into cold granite. Rain pooled in the engraved letters, tracing the history of sacrifice. There it was, Commander Aaron Vale, listed among the fallen. Caldwell stared at it for a long time, then said quietly, "Someone made sure he stayed forgotten." McCreary exhaled, shaking his head. "How does a man die on paper and walk the earth in silence?" The sky grew darker as thunder murmured in the distance, the storm returning like a reckoning still unfinished. Back at the gas station, Marla scrolled through her phone, searching every database she could find. A news article surfaced. Commander Aaron Vale, missing hero declared dead, 2016. The accompanying photo froze her breath. It was him. The man she'd humiliated the night before. His eyes in the picture were calm, noble, alive. Tears welled as she realized what she had torn wasn't just an id. It was a proof of existence denied. Outside, Caldwell's SUV returned, headlights cutting through drizzle. Justice wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, and it carried the weight of a broken man's name. Aaron had made his way into the neighboring town, blending among the early morning crowd at a diner that smelled of coffee and burnt toast. His jacket dripped water onto the tiled floor as he sat quietly by the window. The waitress smiled politely, not recognizing him. For a brief moment he allowed himself to feel invisible, not as punishment, but as peace. Yet even here, whispers began. A trucker with a radio mentioned FBI presence in Millstone, a man they were searching for by military rank. Aaron's jaw tightened. He folded his hands and looked out the window toward the rising sun, knowing that anonymity was a luxury he could no longer afford. As the day waned, Caldwell and McCreary gathered in the sheriff's office, the air thick with papers, coffee, and unspoken judgment. "He vanished because we made him," Caldwell said, eyes fixed on a faded case file. The bureaucracy buried his service. Someone higher up wanted him gone. McCreary leaned forward, voice heavy. "And now?" Caldwell's answer came like a promise. "Now, we find him. Not to arrest, but to honor him." Outside, the rain stopped, leaving the sound of dripping eaves and distant thunder fading into quiet resolve. Justice was beginning to shift from pursuit to recognition. Night settled once more over Millstone, draping the town in the uneasy quiet that follows revelation. In the sheriff's office, Agent Pierce Caldwell stood before a whiteboard covered with photographs, service records, and faded newspaper clippings. At the center, one face, Aaron Vales, anchored the chaos. He was part of an operation that was erased, Caldwell said under his breath, connecting lines between red markers. Sheriff McCreary leaned closer. Erased by who? Caldwell's silence answered for him. There were names in the files. Names with power, men still in office. Marla Denning entered quietly, holding the restored halves of Aaron's ID in a small envelope. "If he's out there," she whispered, "he deserves to know someone remembers." In a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, Aaron Vales stared at a cracked mirror, his reflection divided by age and memory. The world thought he was dead, and maybe part of him was. He laid out old medals on the table beside his faded uniform patch, each one dull with neglect. A television murmured nearby, news coverage of federal search for missing officer. He turned the volume down, his expression unreadable. "They finally remember," he muttered, his voice calm, almost resigned. He slid the torn ID from his pocket, pressing the halves together like an act of defiance, then slipped it back over his heart. Justice wasn't just arriving, it was catching up. Caldwell and McCreary drove in silence through the winding back roads that led toward the old military outpost north of town. "If what these files say is true," McCreary began, "Vale was never meant to come home." Caldwell nodded, eyes fixed on the fading road. He uncovered something during his final mission, something classified deep enough to bury him alive. Lightning cracked across the hills as the car climbed higher, the air thick with electric tension. What awaited them at that abandoned base was not just evidence. It was the truth that had forced a man to live as a ghost for 7 years. The gates of the abandoned outpost groaned as they pushed them open. Inside, rusted vehicles slept beneath moss and ivy, and silence hung heavy like a forgotten oath. Caldwell's flashlight swept across the interior of a concrete bunker, bullet holes, old maps, and a faded insignia painted on the wall. Project Dominion. "This is where he vanished," Caldwell said. The sheriff examined a stack of rotting files, pulling one open to reveal sealed orders marked confidential. The report detailed a mission that never ended. A cover-up involving civilian casualties and a scapegoat named Vale. McCreary looked up, horror softening his voice. He took the blame to protect the truth. That night, as rain returned in fine, relentless sheets, Aaron walked the same road back toward Millstone. The motel room light still burned behind him, but his eyes were fixed on the distant glow of the gas station. Inside the town, Caldwell and McCreary prepared to make contact, their radios alive with updates. Marla waited by the window, heart pounding as headlights appeared through the rain. For a moment she thought it was the FBI returning. But when she stepped outside, she saw him, Aaron Vale, alive, drenched, walking toward her with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. The storm bowed to silence. Justice had found its voice in the return of the forgotten. The town slept under a shroud of mist as Aaron Vale stepped back into Millstone's lonely glow. His boots left quiet ripples in the puddles along the main street, each step carrying the gravity of a man crossing back into his own legend. At the gas station, Marla Denning waited, half in fear, half in atonement. When she saw him, she froze. The breath caught between apology and disbelief. "You came back," she whispered. Aaron gave a faint nod, his gray eyes calm. "I was never gone," he said softly. The words hung in the rain-heavy air like a benediction. From across the lot, Agent Pierce Caldwell and Sheriff Don McCreary emerged from their vehicles, flashlights dimmed, not as pursuers, but as witnesses. Caldwell stepped forward, the rain softening into mist between them. "Commander Vale," he said evenly, the title carrying both respect and remorse. Aaron straightened, the weight of the years falling from his shoulders. "I stopped being commander a long time ago," he replied. "Now I'm just a man trying to be seen for what's left of him." Marla's eyes filled with tears as she reached into her coat, pulling out the envelope she'd guarded. "I fixed it," she said, her voice trembling. Inside was the restored id, clean, whole, a small act of redemption. Aaron took it in silence, fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The storm had found its calm. Inside the gas station, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Caldwell laid his coat over a chair, setting a file down on the counter. "We found your records, your orders. Everything they tried to erase," he said. Aaron stared at the papers, the ghosts of his past laid bare. "I never wanted them to remember me for what happened," he murmured. "I wanted them to remember what we stood for." McCreary shifted his stance, guilt creasing his brow. "You didn't deserve this, son." Aaron gave a faint smile. "No one does. But sometimes justice isn't about clearing your name. It's about who tells the story after you're gone." Word spread quickly. By morning, reporters began circling Millstone, drawn by whispers of a dead hero found alive. Caldwell tried to hold them off, but the truth had already taken root. Aaron stood outside, watching as the first light of dawn painted the horizon gold. Marla joined him, her voice small against the rising wind. "They'll want your story," he nodded slowly. "Let them have it. Maybe it'll remind someone that truth doesn't die easy." "Behind them," McCreary spoke softly to Caldwell. "You think he'll stay?" Caldwell's reply was faint. "No. Men like him never stay. They just pass through, leaving the rest of us to live up to their shadow." As the day brightened, Aaron walked to the edge of town, the road stretching endlessly ahead. He paused, glancing back once more at Millstone, the town that had judged him, broken him, and finally remembered him. Marla watched from afar, holding his ID close, her eyes shimmering with quiet redemption. Caldwell raised a hand in silent salute. McCreary tipped his hat. Aaron smiled faintly, then turned toward the open highway, where the world awaited without promise or prejudice. Justice had found its balance not in courts or records, but in recognition, the kind written in the conscience of those who chose to see. By the time Aaron Vale disappeared beyond Millstone's border, The machinery of consequence had already begun to turn. In the sheriff's office, Agent Pierce Caldwell fielded call after call from Washington, each one a demand for silence, for compliance, for forgetting. "They want this buried," he said flatly, lowering the receiver. Sheriff McCreary leaned against the wall, his jaw tight. "And you?" Caldwell's stare lingered on the window where rain streaked across glass like tears. "I didn't come here to bury truth. I came to dig it up." Outside, Marla Denning waited in her truck, her face pale under the overcast sky. She knew this wasn't over. What began as shame had become defiance, and justice, once woken, doesn't sleep again. In a federal office hundreds of miles away, a group of men in dark suits reviewed a file labeled Operation Dominion. Declassified. The lead official's voice was cold, efficient. "If Commander Vale resurfaces, we contain the narrative. The incident never existed." Papers shuffled, signatures flowed, and silence followed. Meanwhile, in Millstone, Caldwell printed copies of those same files before the order reached him. He handed one to Marla in the parking lot. "Keep this," he said. "If they silence me, someone needs to remember why he mattered." She accepted it wordlessly, her fingers trembling. For the first time, she understood what justice cost. The courage to carry another's truth when the world prefers lies. Caldwell's decision to defy orders made him a marked man. Within hours, black sedans began appearing on Millstone's outskirts, their tinted windows gleaming like the eyes of silence itself. Sheriff McCreary loaded his revolver and leaned on the railing outside his office, muttering, "Guess justice has got a bounty now." Marla hid the documents in an old oil canister beneath the station's floorboards, the sound of hammering echoing like defiance. The air felt charged, electric with rebellion and truth. And somewhere down the long road, Aaron Vale felt the same unease crawling through his bones, as though destiny had whispered his name again. Aaron reached a small overlook above the valley, where the wind cut sharp and cold. He unfolded a worn letter from Rachel, his estranged wife, its ink blurred, but still legible. "You don't have to keep fighting ghosts, Aaron. Just come home." He smiled sadly, tucking it back into his jacket. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was a truth reclaimed. From the road below, headlights emerged, climbing slowly toward him. Caldwell was coming, alone. The two men met in the wind's hollow howl, their eyes carrying mutual understanding. "I'll come for you," Caldwell said. Aaron nodded. Justice doesn't hide. When dawn came again, the town of Millstone woke to flashing lights. Black vehicles filled the streets, agents spilling out like shadows reclaiming their ground. But inside the gas station, Marla stood tall behind the counter, the hidden files safe beneath her feet. "You're too late," she told them. Out by the hills, two figures watched from a distance, Aaron Vale and Pierce Caldwell. Knowing the truth had already escaped their grasp. "They can take the records," Caldwell said, "but not the story." Aaron smiled faintly, turning toward the horizon. "Stories outlive orders." As the morning light broke over the valley, the two men walked toward it, not as fugitives, but as witnesses to justice unbound. The storm that had shadowed Millstone for days finally broke into sunlight. The town breathed again, though it didn't yet understand why. Marla Denning stepped out of the gas station, blinking against the bright morning, her world forever changed. The air smelled clean, almost forgiving. Inside her coat pocket rested a single flash drive, Caldwell's final copy of Project Dominion. She had become the story's keeper, its reluctant guardian. Across town, the sheriff removed his badge from his chest and set it on his desk, the gesture quiet but resolute. In truth, justice hadn't come through handcuffs or courts. It had arrived through revelation, through courage, found in ordinary people. Miles away, in a quiet cabin overlooking the valley, Aaron Vale and Agent Pierce Caldwell sat at a small wooden table, steam rising from tin mugs of coffee. The war between them and the truth was over, though neither felt victorious. "What happens now?" Aaron asked, his voice softer than the wind. Caldwell stared at the horizon. "Now we live with it and make sure it never happens again." Silence lingered, deep and knowing. Aaron unfolded Rachel's letter once more, smiling faintly. "Maybe I'll go home after all," Caldwell nodded. "Then that's justice too. Two broken men at peace, not because the world was fair, but because they had made it face itself." That afternoon, news broke nationwide. Declassified files reveal buried operation. Decorated officer vindicated. Marla watched from behind the counter as the story unfolded across every channel. Customers came and went, unaware that the woman who handed them coffee had carried the truth in her hands. Sheriff McCreary stepped inside, hat in hand, offering a faint smile. "Guess justice has a way of finding its own stage," he said. Marla returned the smile, tired but proud. "Maybe this town will remember him right, this time." Outside, the American flag above the gas station swayed gently in the wind, not as a symbol of power, but of redemption. Rachel Vale drove into Millstone that evening, her car trailing dust over the quiet road. She parked near the station, stepping out with trembling anticipation. Marla recognized her instantly from the photo Aaron once carried. "He's alive," Marla whispered before Rachel could speak. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she clutched her chest. "Where?" Marla smiled softly. "He's gone again, but not lost." "Not anymore." Rachel looked toward the setting sun, understanding that some homecomings aren't made of distance, but of peace restored. The two women stood in silence, the air golden and still, bound by the memory of a man who had taught them both what justice truly meant. As night fell once more, Aaron Vale walked along a quiet ridge overlooking distant lights. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain, the world vast and forgiving before him. He paused, gazing down at the small town that had tested, condemned, and finally remembered him. In his hand, he held the restored id, creased, weathered, but whole. He smiled and tucked it into his jacket. Behind him, the headlights of a lone car appeared in the distance. Rachel's. He turned toward the light, his figure silhouetted against the stars. Justice, at last, had come full circle, not as vengeance, but as understanding. And in that still moment, everything broken was made whole again.